Lawrence Ellis adjusted the brim of his well-worn Panama hat as he stepped into the cabin of Flight 354. At 74, his every movement was measured, each step a testament to years of life lived with quiet resilience. His brown leather satchel, scuffed yet sturdy, swung gently at his side, a companion that had traveled as much as he had. To most, Lawrence might have seemed like any other elderly traveler, perhaps a grandfather heading off to visit his grandchildren. But there was a certain poise about him, a dignity that came from weathering life's unspoken judgments with grace. The flight attendants stood poised, their bright smiles welcoming passengers. Yet Lawrence noticed, as he always did, how the warmth of those smiles varied subtly from one passenger to another. Some received a touch more attention, a deeper level of courtesy. He'd learned long ago not to let these things settle in his heart, acknowledge them and let them pass, like a breeze on a summer day. He found his seat, 16th C, and eased himself down. Carefully he tucked his hat beneath the seat in front of him and smoothed the creases in his trousers. Across the aisle, a young woman with vibrant chestnut hair observed the boarding process with an air of curiosity. She wasn't scrolling on her phone or flipping through a magazine. Instead, she seemed genuinely present. When her eyes met Lawrence's, she offered a warm smile. "Heading far?" she asked, her tone light and friendly. "To Baltimore," he replied, his deep voice calm and steady. "Visiting my grandson. It's been a while since I've seen him." "That's nice," she said, nodding. "Family's everything." Lawrence responded with a gentle hum of agreement before allowing the conversation to taper off. He didn't mind these small exchanges, but preferred the peaceful silence that often followed. As the last of the passengers settled in, the hum of the plane's engines deepened, blending with the faint shuffle of overhead bins and whispered conversations. Lawrence fastened his seatbelt, his actions deliberate and unhurried. The seat beside him remained empty, a brief pocket of solitude in an otherwise crowded space. The flight attendants began their pre-flight checks, moving briskly down the aisle with practiced precision. Lawrence observed them as they worked, not out of expectation but habit. He noticed how their demeanor shifted, subtly but undeniably, as they interacted with different passengers. It wasn't blatant, but it was there, a slight variance in tone, a fraction more effort in certain smiles. As the plane roared to life and began taxiing, Lawrence leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes briefly. He let his thoughts drift to the reunion awaiting him. His grandson, a budding lawyer and one of his life's greatest prides, had insisted on this visit. "You've always been there for me, Grandpa," his grandson had said over the phone. "Now it's my turn to take care of you." The words had touched Lawrence deeply, though he hadn't said so. His life had been one of quiet strength and enduring others' needs, rarely prioritizing his own. Now for once he was allowing himself to be cared for. When the plane finally took off, Lawrence opened his eyes and looked out the window. The sprawling earth below shrank into a patchwork quilt of greens and grays. He exhaled softly, the hum of the engines wrapping around him like a blanket. As the flight attendants began their service, pushing the carts laden with drinks and snacks, Lawrence watched without hurry. He planned to ask for water, just a simple glass of water, a small request he had made countless times before. The cart drew closer, and Lawrence noticed how attentively the attendants served the passengers ahead of him. Their interactions felt warmer, their smiles brighter. He couldn't pinpoint why, but the pattern was unmistakable. Across the aisle, the young woman with chestnut hair was also watching, her brows knitting together slightly as if she'd noticed it too. When the cart finally reached him, Lawrence shifted slightly in his seat, preparing to make his request. It was just water, after all, a small, insignificant thing. Or so he thought. Cameron Hayes, a young flight attendant with a polished smile, handed a can of ginger ale to the passenger seated just ahead of Lawrence. Her movements were seamless, almost robotic, as though she'd repeated this routine 1,000 times. Yet, when she reached Lawrence's row, her demeanor shifted. Not dramatically, but just enough for someone like him to notice. Lawrence had spent a lifetime observing such subtle changes. She paused, her pen hovering over her notepad, and looked at him expectantly. "May I have a glass of water, please?" he asked, his tone calm and courteous. Cameron hesitated briefly before nodding. "Of course. she replied, though her voice lacked the warmth she had shown to others. Moving the cart forward, she continued to the rows behind him. Lawrence assumed the water would come soon. It was a simple request, nothing complicated. He waited patiently, gazing out the window as the minutes ticked by. Across the aisle, Elena Carter, the woman with the chestnut hair, had been quietly observing the cabin service. Her interest wasn't sparked by any overt slight, but by something unspoken, a subtle imbalance in the way the attendants engaged with different passengers. Elena's gaze shifted to Lawrence, who still hadn't received his water. She hesitated. Perhaps it was just an oversight, she thought. The cabin was busy, and mistakes happened. Surely Cameron would return soon. Lawrence, for his part, showed no outward frustration. His hands rested lightly on the armrests, though his fingers tightened ever so slightly. He had long since learned that patience often carried him further than protest. Still, there was a familiar weight to the moment, a quiet acknowledgement of the invisible lines drawn by others. The cart made its way back up the aisle, now collecting empty cups and trash. When Cameron passed Lawrence's row, he raised his hand slightly, his voice steady. "Excuse me," he said, a gentle reminder. "I had asked for water earlier." For a moment, Cameron blinked as if the request had entirely slipped her mind. "Oh, right," she said quickly, her tone rushed. "I'll get that for you." Without meeting his eyes, she moved on, still not delivering the water. Elena's brow furrowed as she watched. It wasn't an accident, she realized. The omission wasn't hostile, but it was deliberate, a choice rooted in casual disregard. She glanced at Lawrence, who leaned back in his seat, his expression calm but resigned. What struck her most was that he didn't seem surprised. It wasn't the water that unsettled her, it was the ease with which the moment was dismissed, as though it were nothing at all. The cart disappeared toward the front of the plane, and the flight settled into its usual rhythm. Passengers read magazines, dozed off, or scrolled on their phones. Lawrence closed his eyes as if to rest, but Elena noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders, the stiffness that betrayed his composed exterior. Her attention shifted to Cameron, now chatting effortlessly with another passenger near the galley. She laughed at something the passenger said, her demeanor warm and engaging. The contrast deepened Elena's unease. It wasn't just about the forgotten glass of water anymore, it was about the indifference. That indifference carried a weight far heavier than the act itself. When Lawrence opened his eyes, their gazes met briefly. He offered her a small, reassuring smile, as if to say it was fine, not worth making a fuss over. But Elena's heart tightened. It wasn't fine. Not to her. Most of the other passengers seemed oblivious to what had transpired, engrossed in their own worlds. Elena drummed her fingers on the armrest, her mind racing. She didn't yet know how she would respond, but she knew she couldn't let it go. The silence and complacency of the moment felt like complicity, and that was just as troubling. The plane cruised steadily at 35,000 feet, the monotony of the journey lulling many passengers into a quiet stupor. But for Lawrence, the stillness carried an edge, subtle yet unshakable. He glanced at the call button above his seat, but chose not to press it. Pressing it felt like demanding attention, and he had spent a lifetime avoiding being labeled difficult. Across the aisle, Elena was far less willing to let the matter drop. Her unease had grown steadily with every subtle dismissal from Cameron. She watched and waited, determined to act when the moment presented itself. Top of form. Elena Carter leaned forward slightly, her eyes flicking between Lawrence Ellis and the flight attendants bustling near the galley. The water still hadn't arrived. Polite as the crew appeared on the surface, there was a sharpness beneath their practiced smiles, a quiet exclusion that felt both familiar and maddening. "Excuse me," Elena said firmly, her voice steady as she leaned into the aisle. One of the attendants stopped, her smile polite but strained. "Yes?" the attendant replied, tilting her head slightly. Elena gestured toward Lawrence. "I believe this gentleman has been waiting for a glass of water. He asked quite a while ago." The attendant blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Oh," she said quickly, her smile returning, broader now but no less rehearsed. "I'll take care of it right away." She hurried toward the galley, her steps brisk. Lawrence turned to Elena, his expression a mix of surprise and quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice steady but tinged with weariness. "It's nothing." Elena replied, though her tone carried a weight that suggested otherwise. You shouldn't have to keep asking. Lawrence offered a small, knowing smile. Sometimes you do, he said, his words simple but rich with meaning. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and the water still didn't come. Elena watched as the attendant moved leisurely through the cabin, tending to other passengers without urgency. Frustration tightened in her chest as she glanced at Lawrence. His calm demeanor hadn't changed, but there was a quiet resignation in his posture, a kind of acceptance forged by years of similar experiences. Elena took a breath and leaned into the aisle again, catching the attendant's eye as she passed. "Excuse me," Elena said, her tone firmer this time. "I don't mean to be rude, but this is the second time I've reminded you about the water. Is there a problem?" The attendant froze for a moment, her professional facade slipping just enough to reveal a flash of irritation. "I was just about to get it," she replied, her tone clipped. "We're very busy." Elena held her gaze, unflinching. "I understand that," she said evenly, "but everyone else seems to have been served without issue." The air between them grew heavy with unspoken tension. The attendant forced another smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll get it now," she said, her voice low before turning sharply toward the galley. Lawrence shifted in his seat, his discomfort evident. "You didn't have to do that," he murmured, his tone quiet but firm. "Yes, I did," Elena replied, her gaze steady. "It's not right." Lawrence sighed, the sound soft and resigned. "It's not new either," he said after a pause, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "You learn to choose your battles." Elena met his gaze, her expression a mix of empathy and determination. "Maybe," she said, "but this isn't a battle you should have to fight." Moments later, the attendant returned with a glass of water, her movements brisk and her face neutral. She placed it on Lawrence's tray without a word, then quickly moved on as though eager to put the interaction behind her. "Thank you," Lawrence said softly, though the attendant was already out of earshot. Elena watched her retreat, her jaw tightening. The moment had passed, but the tension lingered, unresolved and heavy. She leaned back in her seat, her gaze shifting to Lawrence as he sipped his water quietly, his expression unreadable. The flight resumed its rhythm, but the hum of the engines felt louder to Elena, the air heavier. She couldn't shake the weight of what had just occurred. It wasn't about the water. It never was. As the attendants resumed their duties, moving between rows with trays of drinks and snacks, most passengers seemed oblivious to the earlier exchange. Their attention was fixed on books, in-flight movies, or their own thoughts. Elena couldn't let it go. Her eyes followed the attendants, noting the practiced ease of their movements and the efficiency of their service. Yet something about their demeanor felt calibrated, uneven, as though warmth and attentiveness were commodities distributed selectively. Lawrence sat beside her, calm and deliberate, his posture betraying no hint of frustration. But Elena noticed the subtle tension in his hands, the way his fingers gripped the plastic cup just a little too tightly. "Are you all right?" Elena asked softly, breaking the quiet between them. Lawrence glanced at her and offered a faint smile. "I've been worse," he said simply. Elena nodded, unsure how to respond. His answer was both reassuring and troubling. She leaned back, her thoughts weighed down by the interaction. Had she done the right thing by speaking up? A part of her felt certain she had, but another part wondered if she had only drawn unwanted attention to a man who clearly preferred to avoid it. Not far away, the attendants gathered near the galley, their voices low but animated. Though Elena couldn't hear their words, she sensed the tension in their body language, the quick glances, the tight smiles. She turned her gaze back to Lawrence, whose calm exterior hadn't wavered. Yet Elena knew this moment wasn't as small as it seemed. It represented something larger, something systemic, and ignoring it felt complicit. As the flight continued, Elena resolved to remain watchful. Small acts of neglect carried big implications, and she wasn't about to let this one go unnoticed. As the murmurs spread through the cabin, Elena Carter felt their weight, a quiet current of judgment threading between rows. She didn't have to hear every word to understand. Whispers carried fragments like overreacting, just water, and making a scene. These soft criticisms weren't directed at her explicitly, but she felt them all the same. A man 2 rows ahead cast a glance back, his face betraying faint irritation before he quickly looked away. Across the aisle, a woman tightened her lips and returned her focus to her magazine, her body language stiff with unease. Their reactions weren't loud, but they were unmistakable. A collective desire for the incident to fade into the background, for normalcy to return. Elena turned her gaze out the window, focusing on the endless expanse of clouds. The serenity of the view felt like a stark contrast to the unrest churning inside her. She had spoken up for Lawrence Ellis because it was the right thing to do. Yet now, under the quiet scrutiny of the cabin, her conviction was being tested. Beside her, Lawrence sat composed, his hands resting lightly on his lap. His face was impassive, betraying none of the discomfort Elena felt. But she knew better. His silence wasn't indifference, it was something far heavier. Elena realized then that Lawrence wasn't unfamiliar with these moments. This wasn't his first encounter with quiet exclusion or judgment. He had endured them more times than he could likely count, and he had long since learned to let them pass without protest. His restraint wasn't resignation. It was a survival skill honed over decades. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Does this happen often?" Lawrence glanced at her, his expression softening. "More than it should," he said simply, his tone calm but layered with meaning. Elena nodded, her chest tightening. She wanted to say something more, something meaningful, but words felt inadequate. Instead, she returned to the window, her fingers tracing the edge of her armrest. The hum of the engines persisted, steady and unchanging, a backdrop to the tension that lingered between rows. Elena couldn't help but notice how the atmosphere had shifted. While some passengers avoided looking her way, others seemed to offer quiet approval. A man in the row behind her gave a slight nod when she met his gaze, his expression one of subtle encouragement. Still, the judgment outweighed the support. She could feel it in the way conversations softened as she walked back from the galley earlier, the sharp edges of laughter as crew members passed her row. One of them, the woman who had brought Lawrence his water, had glanced her way, her expression caught between annoyance and discomfort. For the first time, Elena felt a shadow of what Lawrence must have carried his entire life, a quiet scrutiny questioning his place in spaces others occupied so easily. Lawrence seemed to sense her unease. "You didn't have to stick your neck out for me," he said quietly, his voice steady but not unkind. "I know," Elena replied, meeting his gaze. "But I couldn't just sit there." He studied her for a moment. His eyes thoughtful. "That kind of courage is rare," he said, "but it's not always welcome." Before Elena could respond, a voice cut through the cabin. "Miss, can I speak with you for a moment?" She turned to see one of the senior flight attendants standing in the aisle. His neatly pressed uniform and composed demeanor gave him an air of authority, but his expression was carefully neutral. Elena glanced at Lawrence, who gave her a small nod as if to say it was her decision. She unbuckled her seatbelt and followed the attendant toward the galley. The cramped space felt suffocating, but the attendant's posture made it clear this was a formal setting now. "I understand there was an issue earlier," he began, his tone measured. "I wanted to ensure everything has been resolved." Elena folded her arms and met his gaze. "The issue," she said, her voice calm but firm, was that a passenger was ignored multiple times after making a simple request. It shouldn't have taken that much effort to get him a glass of water. The attendant's smile tightened, and a flicker of defensiveness crossed his face. "We're very busy during service," he replied. "Sometimes things get overlooked. It's not personal." "It felt personal," Elena countered, "and it wasn't just me who noticed." The man's jaw tightened, but he maintained his professional tone. "We strive to treat all passengers equally," he said. "I'm sorry if it didn't appear that way." Elena held his gaze, searching for sincerity. She found little. "It didn't," she said, "and I think you know that." The attendant exhaled sharply, his composure slipping just enough to reveal frustration. "I'll pass your feedback along," he said curtly. "Thank you for bringing it to my attention." When Elena returned to her seat, Lawrence didn't ask what had been said, and she didn't offer. The silence between them felt companionable but heavy, each lost in their own thoughts. The rest of the flight passed uneventfully, at least on the surface. Yet the cabin remained charged with tension. Some passengers avoided looking at Elena, their discomfort palpable. Others, like the man behind her, offered quiet nods of approval. Elena sat in silence beside Lawrence, sharing the weight of the moment. Outside, the clouds stretched endlessly, soft and unbroken, but the serenity beyond the window only deepened the disquiet within her. Elena Carter sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the back of the seat in front of her. The cabin around her buzzed with low murmurs, a subdued tension rippling through the air. The earlier confrontation had settled uneasily, leaving behind a mix of disapproval and quiet support among the passengers. From behind her, a man's voice cut through the subdued hum. "Why does everything have to be about race?" His tone was measured, not confrontational, but the exasperation was clear. Elena turned slightly in her seat to meet his gaze. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, with an expression caught between annoyance and curiosity, as if he genuinely sought an answer, or perhaps just validation for his frustration. "It's not about race," Elena replied calmly, her voice steady but firm. "It's about fairness." The man scoffed lightly, leaning back in his seat. "Fairness? It was just a glass of water. People forget things. It doesn't mean it's intentional." Beside her, Lawrence Ellis straightened slightly, his posture signaling quiet dignity. He didn't speak, but his presence alone added weight to the moment. "It's not about the water," Elena continued, her tone unwavering. "It's about the pattern." He asked, and he was ignored. "Twice. That's not forgetting, that's choosing." The man frowned, his arms crossing defensively. "You're reading too much into it," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Another voice joined the discussion, this time from a woman seated closer to the front. "Maybe she's not," the woman said, turning in her seat to address the cabin at large. She looked to be in her 50s, with a measured tone that carried a thoughtful edge. "I saw it too. The way they smiled at some people, but not others. It wasn't blatant, but it was there." Her comment sparked a ripple of murmurs throughout the cabin. Some passengers nodded in agreement, while others stiffened in their seats, clearly uncomfortable. What had started as whispers was now an open dialogue, touching a nerve in everyone present. Lawrence finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "Sometimes it's easier to ignore what's uncomfortable," he said, each word deliberate, "but that doesn't make it right." The cabin fell silent for a moment, his words hanging in the air like a shared weight. The man who had spoken earlier shifted uncomfortably, his eyes avoiding Lawrence's steady gaze. Elena glanced at Lawrence, a quiet admiration swelling within her, not for his calmness, but for the depth of his restraint. He chose his words with precision, each carrying the cost of a lifetime of such moments. The senior flight attendant approached then, his expression carefully neutral, though his posture was visibly tense. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice modulated for diplomacy. Lawrence met his gaze directly, his voice calm. "Everything's fine, we were just having a conversation." The attendant hesitated, his eyes flicking between Lawrence and Elena. "If there's anything you need, please let me know," he said before retreating quickly, as if eager to diffuse the situation without lingering. As the attendant walked away, Lawrence leaned back in his seat, his hands returning to their resting place on his lap. "People don't like to be reminded of things they'd rather not see," he said softly, almost to himself. Elena nodded, her gaze distant. She thought of the man who had questioned her earlier, the quiet disapproval in his tone. She thought of the woman who had spoken up, the hesitant solidarity in her words. The cabin felt like a microcosm of the broader world, a place where uncomfortable conversations were rare but necessary. The hum of the engines filled the silence that followed, but it felt heavier now, more charged. Elena glanced at Lawrence, who had closed his eyes again, his expression peaceful, yet far from indifferent. She wondered how many moments like this he had endured in his lifetime, and how many more would come. From the corner of her eye, she noticed movement. A man in a crisp suit had risen from his seat in the first-class cabin. His stride down the aisle was unhurried yet purposeful, his presence commanding without being overbearing. He stopped near Lawrence's row, his gaze flicking briefly to him before turning to Elena. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and measured. "Would you mind if I sat here for a moment?" Elena hesitated, unsure of his intent. She glanced at Lawrence, who had opened his eyes, his expression curious but calm. With a faint nod, he gestured toward the empty seat across the aisle, inviting the man to sit. The man lowered himself into the seat, his movements deliberate. He looked between Elena and Lawrence, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "I couldn't help but overhear," he began, his tone neutral, but engaged. "And I wanted to say, I think these conversations are important, even when they're uncomfortable." Elena blinked, taken aback by his directness. "Thank you," she said cautiously, unsure where he was leading. The man nodded slightly, his gaze settling on Lawrence. "I've seen this happen before, too many times if I'm honest. It's not right, and it shouldn't be ignored." Lawrence studied him for a moment, then inclined his head in quiet acknowledgement. Elena felt a flicker of hope. For the first time during this flight, it seemed like the conversation was shifting. Not just exposing a divide, but bridging it. Nathaniel Brooks gestured for the man to take the aisle seat beside him. "Please," he said, his voice calm but laced with curiosity. The man settled into the seat, smoothing his tie before leaning slightly toward Nathaniel. "I couldn't help overhearing earlier," he began, his words deliberate, "and I felt it was important to say something." Nathaniel studied him, his expression unreadable. "Go on," he said. The man nodded, glancing briefly at Elena Carter before continuing. "My name is Gerald Johnson. I'm an attorney," he said, his voice steady. "I've spent much of my career addressing issues of equity, racial, economic, social. What I witnessed earlier, while subtle, was not unfamiliar." Elena felt a wave of relief wash over her. Gerald's words carried the weight of authority and experience, tempered with a careful balance of empathy and professionalism. She glanced at Nathaniel, whose expression softened slightly, though his gaze remained sharp. "It wasn't about the water," Gerald continued, his tone low but firm. "It was about something deeper, something systemic. The kind of treatment that often goes unnoticed because it's woven so seamlessly into everyday interactions. But it shouldn't go unnoticed. And it certainly shouldn't go unchallenged." Nathaniel nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "You see it clearly," he said. "Not everyone does." Gerald smiled faintly. "It's hard not to once you've lived long enough, or if you've been paying attention. But calling it out, as this young lady did," he added, nodding toward Elena, "takes courage. More courage than many realize." Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks, a mix of pride and humility. "I just did what anyone should do," she said quietly. "Should," Gerald agreed, "but often don't." He turned his attention back to Nathaniel. "I wanted to thank you, sir, for your grace, and to let you know that what happened here won't stay here. If you're willing, I'd like to help ensure this airline takes accountability." Nathaniel's lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes but carried genuine gratitude. "I appreciate the offer," he said, his voice sincere. "And I believe you mean it." "I do," Gerald replied firmly. "And I've seen how even small moments like this can lead to meaningful change, if they're not ignored." The conversation continued in hushed tones, the three exchanging words that felt heavier than the steady hum of the engines around them. Gerald's presence seemed to shift the energy in the cabin. Passengers nearby leaned subtly forward, pretending not to eavesdrop, while the flight attendants moved with less assurance, their earlier confidence subdued. When Gerald rose to return to his seat, he placed a hand lightly on Nathaniel's shoulder. "If you decide to pursue this," he said, sliding a small business card onto Nathaniel's tray table, "you're not alone in this." Nathaniel nodded, the gesture small but significant. "Thank you," he said simply. Gerald offered a faint smile and stepped away, disappearing back into the first-class cabin. For a moment, silence filled the space between Nathaniel and Elena, an unspoken acknowledgement of what had just occurred. "Do you think it will make a difference?" Elena asked softly, breaking the stillness. Nathaniel turned to her, his expression thoughtful but kind. "Change doesn't come easily," he said. "But it comes. Sometimes, all it takes is for someone to notice and care enough to act." Elena nodded, his words settling deep within her. She turned to the window, watching the endless expanse of clouds glowing faintly in the dim light. The world below seemed distant, yet the issues they had faced on this flight felt achingly close, woven into the fabric of everyday life. Nathaniel leaned back and closed his eyes once more. This time his posture seemed more relaxed, as though a small burden had been lifted. Elena, however, remained awake, her mind restless but resolute. She didn't know what would come next, but she was certain of one thing. The conversation they had started wouldn't end here. As the plane began its descent, the cabin filled with the familiar sounds of passengers stowing belongings and fastening seatbelts. The tense atmosphere had softened but not entirely dissipated. The earlier events lingered, unspoken but palpable, like a faint echo reverberating through the narrow aisles. Elena glanced at Nathaniel, who sat quietly gazing out the window. His expression was calm, but she could sense the undercurrent of thought behind his composed demeanor. When the plane touched down with a gentle bump, a ripple of relief moved through the cabin. But for Elena, the landing marked not an end but a beginning. The weight of unfinished business pressed against her, a quiet insistence that something still needed to be done. She wasn't sure what, but the feeling was unmistakable. Passengers filed out row by row, a slow procession of tired travelers eager to move on. Elena waited, allowing others to pass before rising and helping Nathaniel with his carry-on bag. He offered her a small smile, a gesture of gratitude, but his silence remained steady. As they reached the gate, Gerald Johnson was waiting. Standing near the terminal exit, his posture was relaxed but watchful. He approached Nathaniel with the same quiet assurance he had shown earlier. The bustling terminal swirled with activity. Gerald Johnson approached Nathaniel Brooks, his presence commanding yet unassuming. "Mr. Brooks," he began, extending his hand, "I wanted to ensure you were met properly before you left the airport." Nathaniel shook Gerald's hand firmly, his expression softening. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his tone steady but touched with gratitude. "It's my privilege to," Gerald replied. He turned briefly toward Elena Carter, offering her a respectful nod. "You both handled yourselves with grace back there. I just wanted to ensure the airline fully understands the importance of what happened." At that moment, a woman in a sharp, tailored uniform approached. Her demeanor was polished, her expression carefully composed. Introducing herself as a representative of the airline, she extended her hand first to Gerald, then to Nathaniel. "On behalf of the airline," she began, her tone measured and rehearsed, "I'd like to extend our apologies for any inconvenience or misunderstanding during your flight. We take all concerns seriously and will be reviewing this matter internally." Elena felt the weight of the woman's words, but also the emptiness beneath them. They were the kind of phrases designed to placate, not to resolve. Gerald, however, didn't let the moment slip by unchallenged. "With respect," he said, his voice calm yet firm, "an apology is a start, but what's needed is action. I'd like to hear what concrete steps your airline plans to take to ensure equitable treatment for all passengers." The representative hesitated, her composure wavering slightly under Gerald's steady gaze. "We are committed to fairness and equality," she replied. "We'll be conducting additional training for our staff and implementing measures to address unconscious bias." Gerald nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful but resolute. "Good. I'll be following up to ensure those measures are enacted." The conversation ended politely, but with a clear sense of accountability. The representative offered a tight smile before retreating into the crowd, her promise to follow up trailing behind her. Gerald turned back to Nathaniel and Elena, his expression contemplative. "Small steps," he said, "but steps nonetheless." Nathaniel nodded. "It's something," he said, "and something can grow." As they moved toward the terminal's exit, Elena found herself walking beside Gerald. "Do you think it'll actually change anything?" she asked, her voice low, laced with cautious hope. Gerald glanced at her, his expression steady and thoughtful. "Change takes time," he said, "but it starts with moments like this, with people like you who refuse to stay silent." His words settled deeply within her, grounding yet inspiring. Elena glanced back at Nathaniel, who walked quietly, his gait steady despite the wariness of the day. She wondered how many moments like this he had endured, how many steps he had taken toward change in a world that so often resisted it. When they reached the main terminal, the rhythm of the airport surrounded them. Families reuniting, travelers hurrying to their gates, and the endless announcements echoing overhead. Nathaniel paused near the baggage claim and turned to Elena. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice firm but tinged with emotion. "Not everyone would have done what you did." Elena smiled, a quiet warmth spreading through her. "It was the right thing to do," she said simply. Nathaniel nodded, his expression kind but pensive. "It always is," he said, "even when it's not the easy thing." The three of them lingered briefly before parting ways, each stepping into the flow of the terminal's constant motion. Yet, as Elena walked toward the exit, she felt the weight of the moment linger within her. A quiet determination that this wouldn't be the end of the story for any of them. Gerald appeared again, weaving through the crowd with his purposeful but unhurried stride. Reaching Nathaniel, he extended his hand once more. "Before we go our separate ways," Gerald began, his tone sincere, "I wanted to make sure you have everything you need. My office will be in touch with the airline, and I'll personally see to it that this matter is addressed properly." Nathaniel clasped Gerald's hand firmly, a small but genuine smile crossing his face. "Thank you," he said simply, his gratitude understated but profound. As Gerald stepped back into the crowd and Nathaniel turned toward the exit, Elena stood quietly, watching them both. Around her, the world continued its hurried pace, oblivious to the significance of the moment. But Elena knew. This was more than a fleeting interaction. It was a small ripple in the vast current of change. A reminder that progress, though slow and often resisted, begins with those who dare to just stuck. Nathaniel Brooks nodded, his gratitude understated but genuine. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady. "It means something to know that someone cares enough to act." Gerald Johnson smiled faintly, his expression softening. "The fight isn't new," he replied, his tone calm yet resolute, "but it's always worth fighting." Nathaniel looked down briefly, his fingers tightening around the handle of his suitcase. "It's tiring, though," he admitted, "always having to prove that your experience is valid, that your voice matters." Gerald placed a reassuring hand on Nathaniel's shoulder. His grip was firm yet compassionate. "That's why we stand together," he said, "because no one should have to carry that weight alone." Nearby, Elena Carter felt a lump rise in her throat. She had spoken up earlier because it felt like the right thing to do. But now, watching this exchange, she realized how much seemingly simple act had meant, not just to Nathaniel, but to herself. In the hours they had shared on the flight, Elena had glimpsed the world through Nathaniel's eyes. It was a world shaped by quiet battles and hard-won dignity, a reality she had rarely considered in her own life. "I'll make sure people hear about this," Elena said, stepping closer. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "Not just what happened, but why it matters. People need to see the small things that add up to something bigger." Nathaniel turned to her, his expression soft but thoughtful. "You've already done more than enough," he said. "But if you feel called to do more, then follow that." The three of them stood together for a moment, the bustling terminal fading into the background. It wasn't a grand gesture, nor was it a dramatic conclusion. It was quiet, ordinary, and profoundly human, a shared acknowledgement of a simple truth. Eventually, they parted ways. Gerald disappeared into the flow of travelers, his briefcase in hand, his stride confident and purposeful. Nathaniel moved toward the exit, his pace unhurried, his head held high. Elena lingered a moment longer, watching him go before turning toward the parking lot. As she walked, Gerald's words echoed in her mind. "The fight isn't new, but it's always worth fighting." She thought about Nathaniel's quiet dignity, his ability to endure without losing his humanity. And she thought about herself, about how the small moment had shifted the way she saw the world. The cool, crisp night air greeted her as she stepped outside. Overhead, the stars were faint but steady, their light persistent against the vast darkness. It felt fitting, she thought, a reminder that even the smallest lights could make a difference. Sliding into her car, Elena started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. Her mind lingered on the day's events, replaying every moment, every word. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she was certain of one thing: the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Bottom of form.